Right, good evening, folks. Thank you very much for all coming out this afternoon. I'm very conscious that my first language is English, and it isn't for the room. So please tell me to slow down if I start speeding up. And Stefan, I need you to wave that. I do have a habit of speaking faster and faster, so tell me to slow down. I'm going to just present a little bit of insight into a topic that I think is going to become more and more topical over the next 2 decades, as there is growing pressure on Africa and growing pressure on the open spaces in Africa, one, and two, as society shifts and there is probably more and more criticism of the hunting fraternity. So we're playing with the term goodwill hunting in terms of where does this go, where does it leave us, and is it important, is hunting important, and what contribution does it make? In terms of just going through the presentation this afternoon, I'm really going to touch on 3 issues. The first one is just to understand at a broad level the concept of concession areas, wildlife ranches, and in an African context, what does that mean? The second one is some of the challenges of the hunting model. And then the third, I'm just going to touch lightly on 2 particular issues, which are very topical in South Africa and will become more and more topical globally. One already, rhino, and the second is some of the lion issues. I would ask, I'm going to go through the presentation, but it is intended that it stimulates some debate. So I'm looking for questions that will lead into some more discussion afterwards. So if I can ask that you keep your questions, but please don't forget them. Right, so the first one is just, if you look at some of the key countries in Africa where there is hunting at the moment, and just get a sense of what is that protected area footprint like. So there's roughly 590 million hectares that are formally protected across Africa. Big areas being Tanzania, Botswana, Namibia. The one that is not on there is Kenya, also large, but Kenya doesn't allow hunting, and so I haven't included in the presentation. What is interesting is when you add to that the impact of what are broadly termed concession areas or wildlife ranches. And if you look at the numbers at the bottom, you can see, first of all, the impact on the chart. Effectively, there's again nearly double that amount of land that is regarded as wildlife area. Now, depending, if you're talking to purists from a conservation perspective, a lot of those individuals would write that off as not being wildlife area, as not being conservation area. And of course, when you go and talk in the deep hunting fraternity in particular, they would argue very strongly that these are pristine African landscapes and they're conservation areas. There is the reality, in my opinion, that what these concessions across these countries, what these private wildlife ranches do, is they, if nothing else, prevent a transformation of that land. And so when you look at that, the first point to be debated is you probably find that hunting-driven activities across Africa nearly triple the footprint of conserved land across Africa. Interesting when you add that, just to understand the impact of that, and if you reflect in a German perspective as to what percentage is protected or conserved. If you add those figures together in Tanzania and Botswana, you're looking at nearly, well, over 40% of land mass is under some form of protected or wildlife harvesting management area. South Africa sits quite low on that, sitting at about 18%, despite our reputation. So this is a significant footprint. This is a significant economic engine throughout Africa, and the hunting piece of it is huge in there. What is interesting is when you move into where are these numbers coming off and where is hunting happening and where is the economic impact, is to see how suddenly South Africa and Namibia jump to the fore on that. In South Africa, hunting is big industry. 55,000 animals hunted on a trophy basis every year. Over and above that, there is probably 2 to 3 times that number that is hunted on a local domestic off-take basis, which is double the next highest Zambia, and then again double the next highest Zimbabwe. Key issue as you go down that curve is just access. So hunting in a Tanzania, a Zambia, Botswana, since this study, just as a note, it no longer allows hunting, it's fallen off. But if you go into a hunt in Tanzania is a very different hunt to a hunt in South Africa. Hunt in Tanzania is in big wild game country. In South Africa, increasingly, and a lot of the criticism I'll talk to now, it is in, it's farmed hunting. If you're coming from Europe or you're coming from America to hunt there, that's not what's sold to you. You're hunting in wild Africa, but in a South African context and in a Namibian context, you're hunting on a farm. Just to give you a sense of some of the value of this, I've done it in rand terms, and the reason I did that is just to give consistency because the exchange rate has moved quite a lot. But if you divide those figures at the moment by 14, so in 2013, the hunting industry, the value to South Africa was sitting at around about 100 million euros. Reasonably significant, massive lobby in the country. But it is an overstated lobby. If you look at the total tourism value, the hunting contribution to tourism, because it's packaged as part of tourism, is hunting contributes about 1.5% of tourism income to the country. So it is a small contributor, but an important one within that sector. Okay. Now let's talk to some of the issues that we are facing. So we know that it's important. We know that it is probably stopping the transformation of large blocks of land. But what we're finding more and more, particularly in a South African and a Namibian context, is that the commercialization of hunting is moving this idea of the wild landscape into a farmed landscape. And there is increasingly a shift away from some of the conservation ethics and approaches towards make as much money as possible. Now, what I've done is I've grouped, and there's 3 of these slides that just talk to some of these issues. So there's some of the challenges. The first one, when we're dealing with land management, in a formal conservation, and you think about Africa, you think about big open spaces, you think about migrations, you think about animals being able to move, you think about genetic diversity, those sorts of issues. In South Africa, given the transformed nature of it, if you have wildlife, you have to fence them off. Legal requirement to prevent transfer of diseases to commercial livestock. And so what has happened is we've seen this growth of this industry, but it is the growth of a series of fenced-off farms. And so actually we're landing up in many cases undermining any sort of a landscape level movement of species. Linked to that, we are seeing an active persecution of species which don't have a hunting value. And ironically, what is happening is the species that don't have hunting value are species that are the most threatened from a conservation perspective. That's why they have no hunting value, because you can't get a quota to hunt them. 2 really interesting examples are the wild dog, the African painted dog, and cheetah. You can get a permit to hunt cheetah, but it's 1 or 2 a year in South African context. You can't get to hunt wild dog. As such, if those animals go onto a farm, where a farmer has valuable wildlife that he's deriving an income from, he will shoot them. The third point talks to this, the sort of, we can offer you anything type mentality. So what we're seeing more and more of in South Africa is the ability to do a one-stop hunt. You can come to South Africa and hunt tigers. You can come to South Africa and hunt deer. You can, literally, you can do fallow deer together with kudu and eland in a hunt. And it is pursued on the basis that this is a farming activity. It's reasonable. It's what the market wants. It's good for tourism. It's good for the economy. And so you can imagine quite a lot of growing concern to say, on the one side, this is a conservation activity. On the other side, fallow deer do not belong in South Africa. Neither do tiger. The fourth point, we're seeing a migration in terms of value around novelty species. And so you're seeing two things. One, genetic breeding for bigger and better. And I'll give you a simple example of buffalo. We have a very active wildlife market in South Africa. We have auctions on all the time. You can buy animals. Now, if you want to hunt a buffalo, an average buffalo in South Africa, you will pay somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 euro at the moment. A record price was set on an auction last year where a buffalo bull was sold for just under 2 million euro on an auction. And it was sold for that value on auction because of its stud values. Okay. So effectively what is starting to happen is hunters are actively manipulating the genetics of a number of these species to get bigger and better. Linked to that, we're seeing active breeding towards color morphs. And so we're getting things where we'll get a genetic variation. We're getting black impala as an example, white springbok. That are, when those are coming out, huge excitement when that's born, and that poor animal is taken into a breeding program as fast as possible because there is now a premium being placed on this. And the last one around land is then the issue of overgrazing. And this is a very sensitive one because there's this perception that if you're running a wild environment and you're using endemic wild species, they will self-regulate. And of course, when you're running an operation like that, that's not the case. You are breeding them, and you're breeding aggressively to breed as many as possible, because if you can breed as many as possible, you can take the off-takes. And so we are starting to see in many areas quite active and significant change in landscape. Having too many browsers, we're seeing a loss of tree cover. Having too many grazers, we're seeing a loss of grass cover. And when this is criticized, the challenge back is, but this is a conservation activity. Can't you see that these are wild species that we're breeding here? And it's interesting, this sort of tension around these issues. The second one talks to concerns around the ethics of hunting. Now, technically in a South African environment, hunting is heavily regulated. You have to be a member of a hunting association, otherwise you're not allowed to hunt. By being part of a member of an association, that association will work with you, it will teach you the principles of ethical hunting. It will censor you if you step out of line. And I think largely it does. But there is a growing shift towards easy money. And we're starting to see some activity, more and more of this, that really undermines the ethics of this. So the first one is the concept of hunting from a vehicle. Yeah, in the concept of an African hunt, the idea is that you're on foot. You track the animal. It's a fair chase. There's a fair chance of that animal getting away from you. There's very little chance of getting away from you when you're driving behind it on a vehicle and you can drive up with 50 to 100 meters away and shoot from a vehicle. So hunting from vehicles regarded as, definitely not ethical hunting, but increasingly common. Shooting of female or young animals. So the principle of ethical hunting in this context is that you're taking off the older animals. You're taking off animals that are not actively breeding. And the issue around female and young animals is not so much bad ethics, but just bad hunting. In that individuals are going out, they're not recognizing what they're shooting, or they're just not particularly accurate when they shoot. So they miss what they aim for, and they happen to hit the female next to it, or they happen to hit the baby down the road. Baiting. This is something that it's a well-established practice, quite a questionable practice when you are hunting leopard. That theoretically the only way to get a leopard is to bait it. So it's a way to get it out. But what we are starting to see is unethical hunters baiting animals across farm boundaries, so attracting them onto their farm so they can hunt them, or simply setting up hides where you're baiting animals to come into that. You sit at your hide and you shoot it. Hunting at water holes. So hunting in comfort zones, hunting in areas where animals should feel safe. And then linked to that is the use of spotlights. So hunting at night using spotlights, which in reality there's no fair game involved in that. Not as big an issue in South Africa. At a local level, there's a big issue around hunting with dogs, but not for trophy. But if you go into the rest of Africa, this is something that is more and more flags being raised around. The use of dogs to chase animals down. The use of dogs to tire animals out so that I can drive up and shoot it and it's not going to run away from me. Canned hunting. I'm going to come back to the canned hunting issue now, as well as the hunting of captive bred animals. These are both issues that are going to rear their head a lot in the next few years, and particularly around lion. Right, and then the third set of issues talks to just some of the corruption and illegal trade issues that are creeping into this industry. So the first one is the overshooting of quotas. So technically, across that great landscape that is now a conserved landscape in Africa, your hunting offtake is determined on the basis of an annual census. It calculates how many animals are there. It determines what the breeding rate is from those. And it gives you a fair offtake so that you maintain the number of animals of a particular species. And usually that's a sort of rule of thumb for most species. There's somewhere between 3 and 5% of the population can be taken off. Some of your faster breeding animals, you can go as much as 15% actually. But of course, when you're talking about high value species, the temptation to add a few more on, because you've got a hunter that's there, is there. It's quite an easy one to buy your way into that. And what is particularly worrying is that very often the game count is done by the same professional hunting operators that then get the quota. So, some challenges as to where the ethics in that sit. The concept of retrospective permitting. So technically, again, in a South African context, you can't hunt an animal unless you have a permit to hunt it. But should you accidentally shoot an animal whilst you're out there, we're finding more and more accidental shoots where you come back and ask for your permit afterwards. And, there's a bit of a censor, but if it's 100,000 Rand trophy and you're being fined 500 Rand or 1,000 Rand for it, it's quite an easy one to deal with. the favoritism issue is just the biases that are creeping in, and so how do you determine best practice? How do you determine fair practice? The last one is quite an important one, and this is one that, of course, is particularly dangerous as we deal with wildlife trade issues, and I'm sure in this room we can discuss some of these more. Wildlife trade is a massive industry. Illegal wildlife trade is massive and a serious threat to many of the endangered species around the world. And one of the key concerns around the hunting industry is that it is the back door that allows for illegally harvested species or animals to be traded. And a key issue there is rhino, elephant, but then, just go down the list. This is something that is on the grow. Syndicate crime is sophisticated and is targeting this space. So when we're looking at the hunting scenario, we know that hunting is a key driver behind conservation practice. We know that it is definitely contributing to a much larger natural landscape footprint than would be there if there wasn't some form of a hunting-based activity. No questions about that. The problem is the ethics, the controls, and who regulates this industry, and how rapidly it commercializes, and what the impact of that is. Just to talk about two specific examples, and then I'd like to open to the floor for some discussion, because I think we'll get more value there, I'm going to talk specifically now about rhino. So I'm sure some of you have been following what is going on with rhino, but if you take white rhino, South Africa is credited correctly with saving the white rhino from extinction. So when you went back to 1895, the last crash of rhino were found. It's not clear whether there were 30 or 50, but somewhere between 30 and 50 white rhino were found, the southern white rhino. They had been hunted out at that point by colonial settlers coming into South Africa. And it was a move to a key conservation move at that point to try and save them. That led to the establishment of a number of sort of quite well-known reserves. And if you've been to South Africa, your Shishlui, your Mfolozis, your St. Lucias were directly as a result of efforts to save the white rhino. Basically, by the early 60s, the situation was that there was still only white rhino in one reserve, Mfolozi Game Reserve, and that the population had grown to about 600 animals, but there was very little chance to do anything else. And so there was a move at that point to try and find other homes for rhino. And that was actually in many ways the start of the wildlife ranching movement globally. Because a few brave individuals convinced a few private landowners that they should take rhino onto their land. There was no value to them. It was simply a conservation effort that they would provide a home, a breeding home for rhino. And that started the first moves. And we started seeing then quite a rapid growth in population numbers. In 1979, in South Africa, there was a key legislation change, which basically shifted ownership of wildlife from the state to private landowners. So if you owned land and you had wildlife on it, prior to 1979, that wildlife belonged to the state. So there was no value in you protecting it. And after 1979, it became yours overnight. And that then catalyzed a very rapid growth in the game industry. And then in 1992, there was a further legislation which freed that up even more. And so we saw this massive growth to the point where, actually sitting at the moment, we're sitting with just over 20,000 southern white rhino from around about 50, 120 years before. Massive conservation success story, no question. And a key driver in that, no question, hunting of white rhino. And it was the opportunity to realize that value that achieved that. Hunting in that context, very heavily permitted, limited numbers, quite easily to regulate and to watch, so probably reasonably clean. And the cost of hunting a white rhino is, in South African terms, at the moment around about 500,000 rand for a reasonably sized animal. So in euro terms, our depreciation's happening so fast that I have to keep up, but around about 40,000 euros, 35 to 40,000 euros. Of course, that has changed quite radically for us, and is changing very quickly. So up until 2007, the single biggest drive around rhino conservation was finding more range, convincing more people to take rhino, put them on their lands, encouraging sustainable harvesting and building that program. And then in 2007, we started seeing the start of this onslaught. And as you can see, it has been vicious, with last year losing 1,200 animals. If you follow the media, well, just do the numbers. We're losing 4 rhino a day at the moment. 2013 was a key threshold because those 20,000 animals breeded roughly 5%. So we're now heading into negative territory from a population growth perspective. I'm not going to talk too much detail about this because I'm going to give it to the audience if anybody wants to ask questions afterwards about some of the detail on this, and I'll talk into the depth of it. What are the drivers and what has been done about it? What is interesting, though, is how this reflects back now into the hunting scenario. So the key driver behind the conservation of white rhino was the ability to have your own rhino harvest at 5% per animal on a hunting basis. With this sort of impact, that is rapidly disappearing for 2 reasons. One, if you own rhino, you now have to protect them, and the costs of protecting them are prohibitive. We're talking about heavy military support. 2, if we start declining, the ability to get a permit to harvest becomes harder. And so having driven the success of this, their value, it may now undermine their ability to conserve them. And particularly from a private land perspective, we will probably see in the next decade a significant reduction in the number of rhino that are on private land. Of the total population, about 5,000 sit on private land and about 15,000 on state land. Lots of interesting discussion points around this. And then the other one is lion. And lion conservation, now this is one that some of you may have picked up some of the canned lion issues over the last 15 years, but this is something that is going to get louder in the next year and over the next few years. So lion conservation is something that South African authorities and South African hunting industry talk very loudly and very proudly about. There are approximately 11,000 lion in South Africa, which is out of a total of about 32,000 in Africa. Yeah, so 1/3 of Africa's lions live in South Africa. However, of that 11,000, about 8,000, probably slightly more, are in captive breeding facilities. Now, animals that are in captive breeding facilities cannot be released back into the wild. They've been habituated. Their offspring potentially, under very tough circumstances, could be released back. But when you're in a captive breeding facility, you're being habituated. Secondly, massive genetic issues around these animals. So you need to take those 8,000 off that equation, which suddenly means we're talking about 3,000 odd animals in South Africa, and we've just wiped 8,000 off the 32,000 total for Africa. The next problem is that out of the 3,000 in South Africa that are in the wild, probably 2.5, slightly more than that, are diseased. These are animals that are in the Kruger National Parks and parks of that nature. We have 2 massive problems. They carry feline AIDS and TB, both of which are easily transferred. So we estimate that at least 2,500 out of the 3,000 in the wild are sick as we speak and are transferring that all the time. Virtually impossible to eradicate that because it's also, TB is carried by a lot of the prey. So buffalo carry TB, and feline AIDS is easily transferred. So okay, so we probably are dealing with around about 500 animals in the wild, which, when you start talking about conservation numbers, changes your games totally around these. That's the conservation side. More importantly is how this industry has perverted itself. So let's go back to those captive bred animals. So the first point is that industry is now anchored by a volunteer tourism industry, primarily out of Europe, although an increasing amount coming out of North America and Australia. Youngsters, not always youngsters, desperate to make a contribution, passionate about these issues, coming into South Africa to save the lion. And when they arrive, they're presented with these beautiful little cubs that have been abandoned. In reality, what is happening is just down the road, their mothers are producing non-stop young baby lions that are being removed from them at anything between 3 and 10 weeks. Now, in the wild, a cub lives with its mother for 2 years. Okay? These animals are being factory produced off their mothers to feed a volunteer tourism industry. It is a massive con, which we have to actually deal with. It's, simply put, wrong. Of course, the next point is that they're saving these animals. Now, the minute that you handle that animal, you condemn it to death. Cannot be released into the wild. So they now raise them to the point that they're becoming a little bit too uncomfortable to play with. So then they move on to a walking with lion safari operation, which you can do up until the animal's about 2 years. Okay. If you see footage, or if you ever do this, you will notice that the people walking with you, that are guiding you, are carrying sticks. And you'll notice that the lions are very scared of those sticks because they've been conditioned. And if you are familiar with some of the elephant conditioning issues, it's circus training of lions in practice. We're not talking about 5, we're not talking about 10. We're talking about thousands of animals as a pipeline that are going through this process. So now they get to 2. Those rescued cubs that have been saved are now migrated onto 1 or 2 destinations. They're either sold into hunting operations. I challenge you to leave here and go online and try and book a lion hunting safari in South Africa. Just Google lion hunting in South Africa. You'll be stunned by what you find. You'll go online and you'll be presented with pictures of lions that are available for you to hunt. Okay, you can choose. You download which animal you want. You will, if you want to, go further and negotiate. And ultimately, you'll figure out that you've got the ability to fly into Johannesburg, be picked up, drive a couple of hours to the wild Africa, to be met, and then within a day or 2, they will have found your lion, and you'll be able to shoot the lion whose photograph was on the internet and go home and tell the world about this. Okay. Clearly dodgy. If they're not hunted, the latest move, and this is exploding on us right at the moment, is they are then slaughtered for the lion bone trade. With last year, 2,000 carcasses were exported from South Africa to China. This is a replacement for tiger bone. So there's simply no longer tiger available for the tiger cake and tiger wine industry in Asia. And so lion bone is being exported as a substitute for that. So we have a big problem in terms of how these industries are now perverting themselves. And this is all about money, and you can understand that. Those volunteers, do yourself a favor, go online, try and be a volunteer in South Africa. I think you'll be stunned by how much it costs. You'll be paying between 2,500 and it's about 2,500 euros for 2 to 4 weeks, excluding flights. Okay. There's a big expose on at the moment. We have facilities where at any one point in time there are 30 to 40 volunteers rescuing cubs. You then get home, get a photograph of the cub and are encouraged to adopt it. They come back a year later to go for a walk with their cub that they rescued. At the end of that year, they are told that their lion has been released into the wild. Yes, it was released into the wild to be hunted, or it was slaughtered. Okay, so our challenge that we're facing really is that clearly wildlife ranching is important. We know that, we can see that it underwrites 2/3 of the natural landscape in an African context. Hunting underwrites that. There's no debate about that. And what I'm talking to you is not about the average hunter. It's the 10, 15, 20% possibly, except for lion. So 90% of lion that are hunted are what I've described to you. But it's this group that are causing massive reputation problems and are undermining all the ethics, the reputation, the goodwill, the good faith in this industry. And so we're seeing this tension growing now around landscape conservation issues, around this term of sustainable use. I'm sure that in this room we could have this discussion, and how is sustainable use being perverted and twisted. And then this concept of ethical wildlife trade. At the moment, the South African government condones fully the export of lion bone as a sustainable use and ethical trade opportunity. Right, that was to get the discussion going. Happy to take any questions, and you will get my opinion. That's what you're getting. Okay, so.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very exciting, interesting, informative presentation. Yeah, and I can imagine there are lots of questions now. So the floor is open. First question.
Yeah.
What's your solution?
Okay, well, first of all, I think that there needs to be a lot of pressure put on the hunting associations that they consciously improve their regulation. Okay, so that's the first. So it's not about stopping hunting. I'm not in any way advocating stopping hunting. I think that would be dangerous. But it is about hunting associations thinking about what the boundaries of this thing are. So that's the first piece. That's in general. That's general hunting. In terms of, we'll have a rhino. Someone will ask me a rhino one. We'll get into a rhino one now. The lion one is a lot harder, okay, because the reality is the solution is to stop any form of captive breeding of lions, unless it is explicitly and clearly about releasing lions into the wild. And nobody's been able to do that yet. So we wait to see. Which means that we sit with somewhere around 8,000 lions that would need to be euthanized, which is quite a difficult thing to push through. I don't think that'll happen. I think that as the pressure comes in, so what we are doing is, and over the next 2 years you'll see it happen, there's going to be a big campaign growing. There's a campaign against canned lion hunting. At the moment, we're going to hit volunteer tourism. So we'll hopefully be able to squeeze that so that it's not as attractive, which slows down the breeding on that one side. And then we're going to be squeezing the trade in bones on the other side. And I think what will happen is that those 8,000 animals will actually just disappear into lion bone before any legislation comes to effect. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
What do you do then?
Yeah, and that is a real challenge. So the first thing is the 2,500 that are in the wild in South Africa that are sick, there's not much we can do. So those are diseased landscapes now. What does happen at the moment is when you're moving lion around genetically, or you're introducing, you have to, if you start a new population, you have to source from clean animals. And there's a lot of testing that now goes on that there's very little chance, even, your source wildlife is not diseased. So when new area comes under conservation, formal conservation, it tends to be a clean area. And so there's a move towards that, but of course, this is a very slippery line. The big challenge around those 500 is for us to go back to growing lion habitat and range, not habitat, range. And we need to find new areas and refocus our efforts. But we haven't done that. We haven't done that for years because from a national government perspective in South Africa, we can't. The government believes lion conservation is not an issue. We've got 11,000 lions out there. They don't treat lion conservation as if there's 500 animals. So we need to get that conversation going. But there's no simple answer in there, unfortunately.
Daniel.
Allow me to be a bit cynical, yeah? This 8,000 something is the surplus you cannot manage in your landscape as wildlife. So it's essentially a livestock.
Sure. No, it is.
It's a livestock. It's farming life.
Yeah.
So you don't have under which ground are you going to intervene with that as an animal rights thing or trying to give the genetic code because it's not valid anymore. It's producing so it's not. And what I think should be done, scientifically and logically, from my perspective, would be just to keep these guys aside, keep their business, their farming, whatever they want, if they can. But the only concern would be animal rights. And the other thing would be now, how many lions you can in your country properly. I mean, under this ranch model or natural parks, maybe match with the other countries on the world. And that would give me the logical model. Why to intervene with this 800 or something?
So, I think there's a strong argument about, breed. If we're going to breed and we want to hunt, that's fine. And if people are happy hunting canned animals, yes. And if we want to supply to China, we can have those arguments. What we can't do is get volunteers who pay on the basis that they are saving the life of a lion that has been abandoned, and that lion will be released into the wild on a massive scale. Can't allow that. That is a con. So we have to get that out of the equation. So if they're going to do that, then they need to figure out how they do that without this flow of tourists who are paying to cuddle and love lions on the belief that they're going to be released, rather than hunted or slaughtered for lion bone. Okay, so that's the one piece that we have to deal with, because that's a con. It's a con on a great scale, but it's a con. The piece around the sustainable use, you can take there is an animal welfare piece of that, and that is something that does come in and out. There was it is something that I think will tighten up. It's definitely better than it was 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, when this was first exposed, it was horrific. It was battery farming the lions, effectively. So if you think about battery farming the chickens, that's how the lions were being bred. They've moved from that to sort of zoos, but issues there. From a wild lion perspective, at the moment, actually, the wild range can only sustain 3,000 animals. That's why they're there. Most of the animals that are in smaller reserves are on contraceptives, to be honest. So if you go to a Tembe, or you go to a Pinda, or you go to actually a Shishliu and Filozi, the lions are on contraceptives. So we have to find more range. We have to grow that lion range. Yeah. But I agree with you. The middle ground, there's debate space. I find it unpalatable, but I agree that there's debate space. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. I mean, all this huge revenue that is obtained with the hunting. Is there any chance that part of this revenue is reinvested somehow in not the case?
Like,
Let me add, who's earning with that hunting?
where does the money go? Where's the flows? Okay.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Okay. So, is some of it reinvested in? Yes. Okay. I think that the question is how much? What percent? So if you go to Safari Club International, it's the largest hunting show on the planet in Las Vegas, just been on now. I mean, you're talking about, they have hundreds of thousands of people that go through there. It's all about how hunting, the hunters are the great conservationists. That's the message that they put out there. And that hunting underwrites conservation across the planet. So the only reason that there are black bears is because we hunt them. The only reason there's grizzlies is because we hunt them. The only reason, that's the argument, okay? And seriously, I mean, we can show you footage of this. That's the message. And yes and no. The argument then, they talk about how our hunting income is the revenue that makes this stuff work. But that's where it starts getting dodgy, because the amount that actually gets through onto the ground, the leakages that happen above it, are very interesting. So most of the money, so if you're an American and you buy a trophy, you're going to buy a hunt into South Africa. The only thing you'll pay for in South Africa is your accommodation. The rest of it stays in America. Because there's no ways in South Africa that if you own an operation in South Africa that you want those dollars coming into the country. You keep it out the country. Okay. And of course, if you go into Tanzania and Zambia, exactly the same thing. So the amount that comes into the country is a fraction of the actual declared number. But that's no different to most business. But it is, again, this fine line that is argued about how this is underwriting and making this all possible. Does a percentage go in there? Yes, I'm very comfortable to say that. Does the majority go there? No ways. I would imagine probably 10 to 15% of the value goes back onto the ground. Yeah. Leakage. It's a classic, yeah.
Yeah, no,
Do you know if there's anything done to inform the volunteers what's actually happening? Because
So do yourself a favor, go online and get into this, and you'll see that there is a massive social media debate about this issue, because it's compelling. You know, it's when you go and you arrive. So first of all, when you go online and you see what's advertised, you know, it's very clear that you're doing great stuff. And when you go and you spend 2-3 weeks, 2-3 months, and you take this thing and you take it all the way through, it's a life-changing moment. I will not take it away from anybody. I would love to, personally, selfishly, I'd love the opportunity to take a baby cub lion and to raise it. You know, I mean, wow. I'm not going to do it because I condemn it to death. And so there's a raging debate, because a lot of people are saying it's all propaganda. It's against us. Don't believe it. You know, what we have, the expose is coming. You're going to see. I mean, it's horrendous.
Why don't we have a real option for that? A conservationist option for these guys that are going there with a good, I mean, they have good, want to really pay attention for conservation.
So there are. There's lots. So this is a big industry, this volunteer tourism, conservation volunteer. There are, but it's not as sexy. Because the genuine option is you go and you track lions. And you fix fences and you collect snares. You don't play with them. And that's the subtlety. Yeah.
I mean, coming from the other side, I have the luck to visit South Africa. I'm coming from the perspective of managing grasslands and stuff like that, and see the game there in the farms, in the ranch. No, I'm not talking about lions, but all the other stuff they have there, and you realize that when you have game there in the farm, the grassland gets better. So there is a lot of good.
Well, and that's exactly my point. This is not an anti-hunting and it's not an anti-ranching. It's about flagging that there's some. It's like driving. Okay, so the way to do it is we all drive cars. We need to drive cars. We can drive cars wisely. And if we do it properly, it's great. But it's those idiots around us that are doing stupid things that are causing trouble. It's exactly the same thing. There's a number of species, I use rhino as one, there's a number of plain species that have been saved from extinction by virtue of hunting. So there's a lot of positive, but it's this piece around this thing that's causing the trouble.
And maybe a word about the big picture of what's happening with the landscape. I mean, the fencing, that's a big problem because you don't have any more migration of animals, and that's created really a huge ecological problem at the continent level, let's say, or in the country level, if you want to talk about it. Maybe a word about that.
Yeah, so the fencing issue is, it's a challenge. So from a conservation perspective, the big drive is to consolidate areas. So we spend our lives in South Africa on the conservation movement, pulling down fences, convincing this farmer and this farmer that they can work together. But understand that in the rest of Africa, where fences are not common now, fences will be very common in 20, 30 years. So what's happening in the rest of Africa is what happened in South Africa over the last century, where you get a massive growth in population and a massive growth in agriculture, which means all your wild areas are destroyed or lost, and then you start realizing that, so you start clawing them back. So that's what in South Africa is not a wild area. South Africa is a transformed landscape. We now are restoring that. In the balance of Africa, that's happening very quickly now. So if you go back to Tanzania, 40%. I would be very surprised if 20 years I can stand here and show 40%. I think it's probably down to 15 to 20%. It'll come back, probably, but it's almost like we have to learn this thing again. We have to try every known form of agriculture before we realize that some such doesn't work.
Stefan Hermann is one of the co-organizers, and he invited Andrew.
So I'm still asking the question, probably rather to highlight. Maybe you can elaborate a bit. We've been talking a lot about conservation. I know that the Wildlands Conservation Trust, of course, works also a lot with communities. So the question would be more or less, what is the role of the local communities? How or do they actually benefit from the hunting? And then I think it would be also interesting to learn a bit more about alternative models. We have actually one program in some kind of, which is funded by a German Ministry for Economic Cooperation, which might give also an impression of how things can also be managed with involvement in income generation for the locals.
Sure. So if I take a step back and just explain, you've got to get context in South Africa. So in 1994, you would have watched the Rainbow Nation happen there. So the reality of land ownership in 1994 was that, and the numbers are pretty exact, 84% of land was owned by roughly 16% of the population. So 84% of the land was owned by the 16% white South Africans. 16% of land was owned by the 84% black population. Okay, it's 17 and 83, just the way the numbers work out. So when we talk about ranching, we're talking about white-owned farms. Private farms. Talk about concessions in the rest of Africa, you're talking about communal areas. In South Africa, you're talking about white-owned farms as of 1994. Over the last 20 years, there's been a move to try and redistribute land and then also restitute. We've seen a movement in about 15%. So it's now, it's now 70%-ish as opposed to 85. Okay, 84. In that process, there were quite big blocks of game farms, private game farms, that were restituted. And the reason for that is that that was the lowest value agricultural land. Okay, because the way the government did it is it went after willing buyer, willing seller basis. So one, you claimed your land, but you claimed your land with a few million other people, and there's a queue of claims. Now the government looked at what land And then so when shopping, you shop from cheapest to most expensive. Okay. Not always, but that's the general pattern. So really high value, as an example, there's very little sugarcane land has been restituted. Very little timber. There have been a few, but not on a scale. Lots of game farm, and particularly marginal game farm has been restituted. Not the high value stuff, the lower value stuff. But we started seeing a migration of this, where land that is really only suitable for game farming, because that's the other thing, is it's not actually suitable for other land uses, other agricultural land uses, has been restituted to communities that were dispossessed of it over the previous 60, 70 odd years through apartheid legislation. Now, generally, and so in that space, there's quite a lot of work going on to see how we can start transforming this industry. So how do we get black ownership into game farming in South Africa? One of the projects that we're working with is a 12,000 hectare area up in northern KZN. We started working with that particular community in 2002. It's a community that were totally dispossessed of their land. It's unusual. They were chased. They were loaded on and totally moved away. And so when they won their land back, they've actually come in from all over the country to start moving back onto this area that was theirs as recently as 40 years before. In those conversations, our discussion with the community leadership was, guys, you need to think about this carefully, because you've got 10 to 20,000 people that are going to come back to this area. You will get, at the end of the day, about 30,000 hectares of land, so a chunky piece of land back. You need to think about how you keep your economic value of this whilst you get some land use planning going here, because that's not normal. You know, the normal is settle. And this particular community, under a very difficult situation, agreed that they would zone it. So they have set 12,000 hectares for a community game reserve, with a view that that could be an economic engine for them. They've also got some sugar cane, and then they've got another 8,000 they kept for cattle. And then they've basically got 8,000 for residential. So we've worked with them on the game reserve area. Tough journey, because you're talking about marginal areas. Previously owned, the 12,000 hectares was owned by 8 individuals, okay, who lived a life off it. They weren't rich, they lived a comfortable. They're very rich now as a result of selling their land to the state, ironically. But living on the land, they lived. But, you know, now we've got about, I think about 5,000 people have moved back that are all expecting a return from this land. So it's getting that balance right. We have got to the point now, after 10 years, where the reserve is just, as of the 1st of March, getting to a point where it'll break even from an operational perspective. It does provide employment for 100 local community members, and is the single biggest employment in the area by a long while. And we're moving now into helping the community actively manage the ranching of their wildlife on that, but doing it in a way that is conservation friendly. So we're trying to get these balances right. They do have rhino, we put wild dog on there now, et cetera, yeah. But it's an interesting journey in terms of the economics of it. Yeah.
I would have a question for the alternative values, because you said that the hunting is preventing large tracts of land of being converted. Now, what I thought, if I have a really productive soybean plantation, wouldn't it be more attractive economically than this hunting industry? And how much of land is really being preserved by this? Because just as you said, there might be tracts of land where they do this, but they are not economically attractive from an agricultural point of view. So how much is really being preserved by it?
Yeah, no, I think a very good question. So I'm going to give you the 2 different scenarios. South Africa and Namibia is different. South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia are different to the rest. Okay, so in South Africa, the land that is ranched, almost always, at some stage, there's been other agricultural activity tried on it and failed. Okay, so is it, you know, it would probably be lying fallow if it didn't actually have wildlife on it. So the argument holds. In the rest of Africa, Tanzania, Zambia in particular, the concession areas are areas where, as a result of very low development, very low population, these were big open areas that weren't being used, and conservation NGOs have got involved and motivated that they become buffers to protected areas, because that's generally where they are, as economic engines. So then they've articulated that. What's happening now, though, is as Africa's development curve does that, as infrastructure goes in, those areas are suddenly becoming attractive as soybean plantations. And so I think we will see the big concession areas in Africa, a lot of those are going to shrink quite dramatically over the next 2 decades as we attempt many different forms of agriculture into that, some of which will succeed, some will fail. The ones that fail will then probably revert back to some form of a wildlife model afterwards. So yeah, it's a fine line as to whether this is actually keeping it or whether it's just an economic use of the land that works. Yeah.
Then I would have a following question, if I could. I mean, if you have these two competing values, yeah, is it really a good strategy to base your conservation on hunting if someday you have to think that there will be a value that's bigger, an economic value that's bigger than this one, and replace it? I mean, somehow you're getting into a track, yeah, where the conservation is based on this hunting thing and on its economic value. So, I mean, what's the implication of this? Because at the end, people will compare the two values. Yeah, what's my option? Which value do I choose?
Yeah, it depends on who's presenting it. So, I mean, again, is it an academic presentation or is it a practical presentation? So remember that when those concession areas are put in place, you don't have the competition on the ground. So you don't, it's a group of environmentalists have gone in and said, you've got this land, we would like to help you establish a concession. Okay. Not a development, sort of a objective community development person that's gone in and said, let's see what the best use of this, okay, this one's going to be cattle and this one's going to be wheat and that one's going to be game. And then other areas, it's the agricultural guy who's gone in and said, I'd like to help you and I'm going to put cattle on you. So there's a big difference between the desktop hypothetical planning and the practice on the land, and the practice on the land is always going to be vested interest. So there's no doubt that those concession areas that are there, not the ranches are economically driven. Concession areas have been driven by civil society, environmental civil society, who have pushed hard with the interests of the community, but also their conservation interests. And so that's the best option that was on the table for the community at that point in time.
And our last question. Bad luck.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the interesting presentation. My question goes a little bit into a sort of different angle or perspective, because you mentioned once the word syndicates. I'd be interested about the evidence there is possibly on links between the hunting industry and what's considered organized crime.
Yeah, so we could spend hours talking rhino if you wanted. Okay, so the first thing is, in terms of rhino poaching, we have clear evidence that it's syndicate driven, to the point that we know that international syndicates in a South African context on a monthly basis place an order for rhino horn. Local criminal syndicates that we can name and identify tender for that to supply it. Okay, it's as structured as that. There's a whole thing that flows through it. I can explain that, but there's a whole thing. In terms of the association of the hunting industry, that has largely been blown out now, but in that first run-up, and in the big exposés were in 2009, 2010, and 2011, the soft sources of horn were hunters that were enabling the hunting of trophies for the horn to be exported into Asia. And they were using proxy hunters. So there were two classic stings that were being done, and again you can find the stuff. The first one was there was the expose that was caught was a Thai businessman who owned a brothel, a house of disrepute in Pretoria, and And what came out was that one particular hunter in one season, he got 12 permits to hunt, and 12 different names and 12 different photographs, but they were all these little Thai girls who couldn't hold the rifle. They were posed with the rifle. It came out that a PH had shot the animal, and then the horn went off into the syndicates. Okay, so that was a direct tie loop. And then the other one was there were syndicates that were recruiting Polish and Russian hunters, paying all expenses covered to come to South Africa, hunt a rhino, on condition that they gave them the horns, and the horns then went off into Asia. Those loops in a South African context from a rhino have been largely shut down. All of those individuals have spent a lot of time in jail. But the reality is that it has been twisted in that space. So it's again, you're probably talking about 2% of the hunting community that got caught up in that. Unfortunately, a lot of wildlife vets also got. So it really rattled South Africa, because South Africa has this, this whole thing about the great stuff we do for conservation, and we have this industry around this, and these professional hunters who will die for conservation, and these wildlife vets, and it came out that, key group of those were right at the heart of it. But those were two classics where explicit, and you can track this. There's both those cases are happening right as we speak. Intense legal, but they'll go to jail.
Okay, there's a very last question, Richard. You raised your hand 100 times, so the last question is for you.
Something that's bothering me, when you said you're going to ban the tourism for lion production, say the lion, or...
Yeah, we want to, yeah.
If you can get rid of that, what's going to prevent the countries that are buying the bone from sending in cheap labor to keep on producing lions?
Yeah, so
are they doing it already?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, short
the answer. Yeah, we don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, probably.
Again, thank you very much for coming, first of all,
Pleasure.
for that nice presentation, for the lively discussion, and the additional information you gave us. So, again, thanks a lot, and